There's some guy somewhere in a bar trying to get a ride home, and somewhere someone else just, riding around looking for a buck to make. So that's a process with Uber, right? And it doesn't really feel like a business process, but there are processes nonetheless.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Jan Recker. Now, Jan is a professor, scientist, writer, speaker, editor, podcaster, board member, and husband, father. But he's also a professor for information systems and digital innovation at the University of Hamburg. I'm very excited for this conversation. We have a ton of mutual connections, and Jan is very familiar with a lot of the people that I have interviewed previously on this podcast series, particularly from the academic realm. So the Marcello LaRosas and the Will van der Rols and Jan Mendling. So really excited for this conversation. Jan, thanks for joining me.
Well, hi, Daniel. Nice to meet you, and thanks for having me. And as a BPM specialist, I think you got that order of things wrong. I would put father and husband very close to the front. Before I get to a lot of the other things, I have to, look after the family.
Absolutely. That's great to hear. And I know that, we had a bit of a conversation before we jumped into this today. And I know that, your journey through the BPM space is very interesting, and I'm really excited to dive into that. But maybe to kick us off, let's start at the beginning and where you were first introduced to this concept, this topic, this idea of a business process management approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Like most people, I'll learn it at university, and I do remember it vividly. It was in my undergrad. I had a class where they taught you process modeling at the time. Now, the time was early 2000s, so just after year 2K. So that was one of the bigger phases for BPM, I suppose. And in my undergrad project, I was doing stuff with ITIL, the IT Infrastructure Library. So, which was a new standard at the time that looked at standardizing a lot of IT service management functions in organizations, from your help desks to incident management to problem management. And it was inherently a process focused, right? So all these were standards for processes for how you run your help desk and so forth. So in my undergrad project work, I looked at them and tried to come up with what's now called reference models, right? So what should these processes look like?
Right.
And then I had the opportunity in my master's and my postgraduate work to do empirical projects where some companies were implementing that ITIL standard from 2003 that came out of the UK. And I was in Australia at the time. And then I did this. So I really got really early into a typical area of BPM, which was standardize your processes. Here's a reference model. Go and figure out if your process looks anywhere close to that reference process. And usually it doesn't, of course.
That's great. That's awesome. And I know that this is when you were first introduced to this topic of BPM. Take us on a bit of a journey, I guess, moving forward, where you saw it in practice, the value that you saw it delivered to organizations. And then I also know that there was a time where you kind of parted ways with BPM, so to speak, because you were challenging the idea that, is this actually delivering value to organizations?
Yeah. So that's a bit of a longer story. So again, this was around 2003, and I came to Australia as a student and did these projects around ITIL, focused on ITIL, and in the department of Michael Roseman, who you interviewed. So there's that connection. And it so happened that Bill van der Rols was in Australia at the same time. So there's that connection as well. And all that sort of motivated me to stay on after my studies were finished, and I was looking for a job. And Michael gave me one. And it was a BPM research job, so to speak. And then another coincidence occurred, which was around 2004. Another standard came up, which was Bpmn 1.0, the business process model and notation, which was called slightly different back then, but it sort of came onto the scene, and it was a new standard. It was proclaimed a standard. And Michael said, why don't you go and research that? Why don't you go and research that new standard? And I like the idea. Will suggested I focus on process mining, by the way, at that point. And I said, what a crazy idea is that? I'm not going to do that. So you got other people to do that. Anyway, so I looked at that adoption of Bpmn in Australia around 2004, 5, 6, and sort of that drove me for a while. So I got into a lot of organizations in Australia that were doing this. A lot of them were service organizations like your state governments, federal governments, your banks, insurers, most of them in Queensland, which was only because I was in Queensland at the time. We also worked with the Australian Taxation Office in Canberra and others, right? So these types of organizations, and they were looking and they were adopting Bpmn. And I got a pretty good view into what they were doing in terms of business process management. And a lot of that was focused around modeling their process, right? So that's what I did for a while. And, also did my dissertation on that adoption of that particular standard, and then moved into other areas, right? So I stayed in the academic side, but very early on, when you study adoption, you have to go and see what organizations are doing, right? So you have to go out there and do what's called empirical research. So go into the organization, see what problems they are, see if you can help them, and so forth. So I did that for a long time. And I mentioned that because that is a little bit different from some, I guess, other academics in the field that are developing new solutions and new formalisms and work a little bit more technically. I was a bit different in the sense that I worked very empirically and always looked at, that's what they're really doing. So right. Bpmn, not so much of what the standards can do, but what the organizations are doing with it, and whether they're really using it, and whether they're using correctly, or whether they're using it fully, and what they get out of it, and what the value of that are, and what the challenges of that are. And and we not me myself, but me and others, we wrote a few papers on these topics. What's the value of process modeling? What are the benefits? What are the challenges now and in the future? How are organizations using Bpmn? So I found that very, very exciting, but I also found that it was in contrast to what the textbook said.
Right. Okay.
And so also what sort of some fellow academics were saying about some of the tools, the techniques, and the methods that we've developed. Well, not me, but others had developed at the time. And I was like, well, that's not really what they're doing in practice. In practice, it seemed that BPM was a lot of organizations wanted to change. And for some reason or other, they heard of BPM and they got a bunch of people together that could do this. And they called it in different terms. Some had BPM Center of Excellence. Some had process managers. A lot of them just had business analysts or IT people or HR people that were, sort of tasked with managing change. And a lot of them then took to the BPM methodology and sort of started implementing that and said, okay, we got to go in, we got to contextualize the process first, we got to model it, and then we'll do some magic improvement and we'll model that new process and we roll it out. So that's what everyone was doing, and it was successful in some cases and in others was not. But because I was dealing with so many organizations, I found so many instances where they wanted to do things that sort of by definition you couldn't do with BPM because it wasn't in the textbooks, and there was no button in the tool that you could click, and they still wanted to do this. And I found that weird that we were propagating this one thing and organizations tried to do this other thing.
Right.
So maybe I should give it an example for this. That sort of stuck with me for 15 years. We were working with IP Australia, the patent office. Yeah, in Australia, the IP Australia, and they asked us to come in and train their trainers. So we went in and they started to build sort of like a BPM Center of Excellence, a team of analysts and managers and people to be responsible for managing the processes of that patent office. And we came in and we basically trained what is now in everybody's textbook on BPM, right? So this is how you model, this is how you analyze, this is how you improve, this is how you implement, this is how you manage change, and so forth. And they said, well, okay, let's talk about one particular process here. This is the patent application process. And it was a long process because it's a legal process and it's complicated. And I looked at it and I said, sure, we can make it heaps faster and streamline it. And look at this, there's lots of feedback loops and stuff like that. And they said, no, Jan, we don't want to make it slower. We want it to take 15 years. I said, excuse me? And they said, well, we want this process, which takes about 6 to 7 years. We want it to be slower, so it takes 15 years. And I was like, why would you do that, right? And there's some very good reasons, because as you file a patent for application, it sort of gets put into this Schrödinger's cat status, like an interim status where you don't know whether the patent will be granted or not, but it comes with certain legal properties. So because you have to assume, or others have to assume, that it may get granted, that particular patent. So if there's another person filing a similar patent, they have to sort of take that into account and relate their work to this potential other work. And you can use a lot of things with these properties. You can stifle your competitors' innovations. You can get a lot of legal security around an idea, even if it's not even fully developed. So it was some good reasons. But in all our BPM textbooks and all the BPM experts at the time, they wrote a lot about how to make your process cheaper and faster and better. There was nothing in there to make it slower, right? And so I found this example, and it's like, well, you can picture me with a big textbook in my hand. It's like, I don't know. Let me look it up. There's nothing. We have nothing in here, right? So all our process redesign strategy weren't really about making things slower and introducing other things, and So I found that fascinating. It was clearly BPM, right? They were managing an end-to-end process. They just had very different incentives at the time, right?
Right.
And that was around 2008 or 9. And that was the first one where I was like, well, hang on a second. And then a year or two later, in the wake of the global financial crisis, where I saw two things happening. Number one, because of the crisis, and a lot of the organizations sort of stifled their initiatives, not because they didn't believe in BPM, but because a lot of these initiatives were sort of connected to the IT department, and a lot of them stifled their budget for innovation. They said, okay, well, we don't have any time for this. We don't have any time to play around with new technologies and see how they might fit. We have to buckle down, get down to business, and get our core right? So, for example, we were working with Woolworth at the time, and Woolworth had its fingers in a lot of pies, so to speak. But, of course, essentially the supermarket. So in the wake of that financial crisis, they buckled down and said, let's be an excellent, super efficient supermarket operator first. And we'll forget about all the other stuff. Any innovation, transformation, sort of weird ideas that we have, we're going to pause them for a while. We're going to make sure that we get our balance sheet right? So that happened. So that meant a lot of sort of interesting exploratory application areas were sort of left out, and instead a lot of the organizations went back to combing through their process and trying to get them as efficient as possible. Lots of automation happening, lots of streamlining and standardization happening at the time, right?
Yeah.
And I guess that was effective, but it was also very boring, in the sense of, we know how to do that, And we also know, like, as a researcher, I felt like, well, we know how to do that. We know where it works. We know how much is good and how much is too much, and so forth. It didn't feel as exciting, because it was also the time when, in the wake of that financial crisis, lots of new technologies did come up. So obvious examples were social media came up big, right? Mobile computing, handhelds, iPads, all these sorts of things came up big and really took on in the business world around 2008, 9, 10. Analytics came up, all these things, but BPM was brought down to something that it was in the 90s, which was maximize the efficiency gains in your backend processes.
Right.
So there's nowhere seen next to the customer, but all the internal backend processes were standardized and automized and so forth. And a lot of them ran around and said, like, we saved so much money here, and we saved so much money there, all of which is fair and true. But in the world out there was something exciting happening. We had Uber coming up, we had Airbnb coming up, we had Facebook coming up, all sorts of companies threw out new apps, and all of that felt disconnected with BPM. So BPM was in the backend office doing an important but boring job. And out there were this new wave of digital technologies coming up. And these two things didn't seem connected. And I felt that thing about the technology was a lot more interesting than the backend application of BPM, which I felt we've understood.
Yes, right. And now more recently, you're saying that BPM is sort of coming back more on everyone's radar. I think that, I've certainly heard a lot of stories and examples from organizations where, they've tried BPM in the past and it didn't work for them, or they didn't get the value they were expecting from it. But in the last couple of years, I feel like I'm noticing a swing back to this sort of process management or process-centric approach. And I guess particularly because now we've got exciting technology that's allowing us to really look at our data, analyze our data, and make data-driven decisions when it comes to managing our processes. But I guess from your perspective, why is it sort of coming up on your radar again? Why do you feel like it's coming up on more organizations' radar again?
Yeah, first of all, I fully agree with you. And so for a while, around 2012, 13, 14, 15, I got a bit critical of what we were doing as a research field. And I said, like, look, we gotta go back and connect it. So every company had built apps, and all these apps allowed them to connect with their customers, and all of them had process that you can run now from your mobile app. So if you think about a DHS, for example, Department of Human Services, they weren't even the first, but you basically at some stage you could get all your humans, your federal services from the government through your app. Well, you ran all your processes, but again, that was nothing that we could explain or manage with BPM. There was something different, right? They just did it, they built it, and it was operating on a very different scale, right? It was a customer process, so to speak. It wasn't no longer a business process. Uber was the same thing. For a while, I did this exercise with my students and said, try to model the Uber business process. Well, where's the Uber business even, where's it even starting? Normally we have a process that starts with the customer department and ends in the fulfillment department or in the invoicing department. It's all in our box, so to speak. Uber isn't in our box. Uber was all over the place. There's some guy somewhere in a bar trying to get a ride home, and somewhere someone else just, riding around looking for a buck to make. So that's a process with Uber, right? And it doesn't really feel like a business process, but there are processes nonetheless. Anyway, so two things happened then. So I moved for completely unrelated reason. I moved from Australia to Germany in the late 2017. And when I did and started in Cologne at the university, I got all these phone calls from companies in Europe and in Germany specifically saying, hi, oh, you're doing BPM? Well, we're doing BPM. You got to come and talk to us. And my initial response to all of them was, no, I stopped it. It's done. It's sort of, I'm doing something else now. Like, don't call me. But then that volume was breathtaking. And I realized that all these companies around late 2010, right, moving up to 2020, all of them were doing BPM. I was like, how come? What's triggering this all of a sudden? And I think it's because what you said is that we had some new technological advances, right? So Will's idea from 2005 about process mining had really matured. So we had really solutions that were scalable and applicable by now. And with all these technology movements, what organizations were doing, I think they just realized how much data they have about their processes. Right, which isn't I think it's not a consequence of doing BPM, but it's just a consequence of these technologies that we have. That not all that all of them create data, but all of them also create process data. They're all events, they're all timestamped, they're all actions. Every click gets logged, so it has all the ingredients of understanding what a process is. And that wasn't necessarily the case beforehand. Beforehand, we had some systems that were doing this, like your SAP transaction systems. They were recording your clicks and your timestamps and who was doing what when. But who got to see that? Organization that was responsible for the SAP log file, which usually wasn't even your BPM team, it was just some other guy. With these new technologies, because they were operating out there in the world with people and customers and everybody else, virtually anyone can get that data. Yeah, a lot of that you can just crawl and scrape and extract and mine and so forth. And so you had data that was more accessible, and you had better technologies that were really market ready. And I think a lot of that saying like, wow, we can learn a lot more about processes that are not just our back office process, how we run invoice verification and application parental leave things, but we can really have a look at what some of our customer facing processes are with data that is detailed, that is granular, and that is available without having to ask some guy in the back-end office and get through 5 signatures before I even get to see the Excel spreadsheet, so to speak. And all that culminated that people said, oh, okay, well, let's manage that process better. Because I think a lot of the organizations were just trying to establish these new processes through the new technologies. And once they did, they said, okay, we have processes now, but they're not well managed because no one bothered to manage them, right? We just built them. And now it was time to manage them and see whether they can be improved and so forth. And back we are with Bpmn. So
yeah, right. And it's an interesting sort of topic, talking about these startups over the last 10, 15 years that have really disrupted large organizations, large industries. How do large organizations compete with these smaller startup companies that I guess can radically transform the way they're delivering value, whereas it's much harder to move such a large ship. It's harder to turn a large ship. Obviously, they've got history and assets and, reputation. They've got a lot of things going for them. But despite that, we still do have the Ubers and the Airbnbs and a ton of fintech companies, digital banks and things like that are entering into the marketplace and taking customers because they're delivering a significantly better value and a significantly better experience to the consumer, the customer.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned exactly these examples. That's what I spend a lot of time in the last 10 years on. So, for example, I worked for a long time. I worked very closely with Woolworth in Australia, right? The big retailer company at the time, where they tried to get their IT department, which was responsible for rolling out SAP and maintaining the business processes behind the supermarket operations. So really was a service provider to the national operations team for thousands of supermarkets throughout Australia. And they were really good at that too, obviously. But they wanted them to spawn new innovations. Right. So they wanted the IT department to say, like, you guys got to go out there, figure out the new digital technologies and tell them how they can transform our business. And the IT department couldn't do it. And the CIO couldn't do it. And he knew it well. He said, like, well, I know how to run SAP. I know how to implement SAP in 4,000 stores over the weekend. I'm really good at that. But I don't know what to do with, a beacon, with location-based services, with AI, with the next whatever at that time, Watson Technologies or SAP HANA. I don't know what to do with all these emerging technologies. I know how to handle legacy technologies and roll them out and scale them and implement them, right? So I think a lot of that was a clash in organizing. So the people that were doing BPM or that were doing IT-driven change, what were they good at? What were they trained at? What did they have experience in? And what was needed, right? So I think the story that Woolworth went through is very telling of how organizations dealt with this in general. So they realized, well, our IT department isn't really the place to go for innovations. They're really good for the good old application areas of BPM, which are compliance, safety, efficiency, sort of standardization. And they're really good at this, and they can manage all our business processes on a vastly huge scale very well. If we want to have our innovations, we need different teams that are organized much differently, right? We saw at the time we had all these different organizing methodologies coming up. We had Agile, Scrum, DevOps, different ways for teams to just work and run their projects. And a lot of that didn't fit with classical projects and organizing. A lot of that didn't fit with classical BPM either. If you think about the life cycle, and people say, well, we got to identify first and we have to document second and analyze third, etc. That's not how newer ways of organizing and running projects is. This is also not how a startup works, and this is also not how a new app gets developed, right? So we had very different ways of organizing, agile ways of organizing for building new solutions that wasn't in this classical structured analysis and design process that we have in BPM. So what Woolworth and a lot of other companies were doing or have been doing since is they sort of spread that out. They kept their IT department for being a service center for their operations team. and they had all the different IT innovations basically happening in the areas where they needed them. So the supermarket department got their little IT team together that was working off a green couch in a cool room after agile principles and developed new apps and a story. So, and that caused friction for a while because IT said, we're doing IT, you can't do IT, but they ended up doing it and this ended up working. And a lot of the other organizations were doing something similar. You mentioned Fintech. Well, I think there's a couple of things here. Number one, well, there are new Fintech providers, startups like the digital banks and so forth, or algorithmically optimized loans and stuff like that. But we still have the big banks, and the small players are still small. So no one is disrupting anything here. And there's a couple of really good reasons, because there's a lot of safeguarding mechanisms. We have legislation, we have institutions, we have trust, we have norms. I don't think that a lot of people would give all their money and all their earnings and all their property in Queensland to some digital bank when they have Suncorp around the corner, right? So there's a lot of that too. But the established organizations realized that they can't really compete with the small startups in terms of organizing how they were doing things, right? So the big companies, Suncorp is still doing Bpmn, for I think a lot less application areas that you can use it for. And the little players are, using very modern ways of organizing themselves and developing new projects really, really quickly and really, really fast, right? So I think what a lot of organizations have done over the last couple of years, they teamed up. Yeah, a lot of the little fintech players somewhere, sometimes more visible, sometimes less, they're being backed by the big players, right? So here in Europe, what happens a lot is that the big banks like Deutsche Bank and Crédit Agricole and ING and Rabobank and what they're all called, they're not even trying to do the innovations. What they're doing is they're mingling a lot with the entrepreneurial ecosystems. They go into the startup spaces, looking for solutions they would like to have, and then they're sort of backing them. And sort of making sure that the startups can deliver their team and they have first dibs in terms of license or, being an exclusive customer, etc. But they leave them with their way of organizing and managing everything, and they don't try to make them fit their own organizational model, because as you said, it has a legacy, it has history and so forth. And I think that's that sort of tandem approach that works reasonably well for a lot of the companies. So we studied a lot of fintech startups over the last couple of years and see how they got their solutions to the market, so to speak. And we realized a lot of them are not actually all that disruptive, and they don't even try to be. They actually they come up with an idea, and it's usually fairly disruptive, really cool, emerging, novel technology. And then they dial it down. They dial it down because they want some of their solutions to fit with one of the established players. Right. Because if you're a little, startup in Brisbane side, Suncorp would be your first bet of a great customer. Like, of course you want your solution to work with Suncorp, but you would make it fit so that you can work with the banks rather than against them, because a big incumbent is still a big incumbent, and they have power, and they have assets, and they have money, and they have influence. And your little startup, may have the best idea and the best technologies, but what good does it do you if it's just in your garage, right? Yes, right.
Now, I guess in talking about these, new innovative ways of delivering value to end consumers and customers. I probably should have prefaced you with this before throwing this question at you, but we had an interview a number of months back where we looked at the whole blockchain space as a process, because blockchain essentially is a process in and of itself. And, it's from my understanding, it's going to be a huge thing in our future. I know that many large organizations are starting to invest resources into doing research around that. Talk to us about blockchain, and is it something that you've looked at? Do you see it as sort of under the sort of the banner of process? Do you think it will be the future? Like, business analysts should be exploring that space. Talk to us about what you're seeing.
So caveat first. So I'm not an expert in blockchain, and that was a deliberate decision, because I mentioned in the beginning that I said, well, I'm sort of working empirical most of the time, which means I can only look at stuff once organizations have started doing things with it. And for blockchain, for a long time, that wasn't the case. If I wanted to study blockchain, I literally had to wait to see until a big company was starting to do it and, got some benefits of it or not. So I could go and study these, right? So for a long time, it was just not possible for me to do a lot of blockchain research, so to speak. Having said that, from what I understand that technology to be, I think it's inherently process-centric, absolutely, right? So it's a database technology, okay, but it speaks fundamentally to processes, right? That's the main idea behind it, I think. So I think it has enormous value in connecting blockchain with BPM, absolutely. And I also think it speaks specifically to certain application areas. And the obvious ones are trust-based processes, anything around compliance. So where you have to ensure that a process is run in a particular way, not necessarily to make it the fastest, the best, the cheapest, but really to make it the most compliant. And that's a strength of that technology, right? And from what I see where that sort of technology is being used already, or at least being explored, it's in areas where we have institutional processes that are not compliant and not secure and not trustable. So for example, certain governmental processes in countries where there's corruption and we don't know and we can't trust some of the institutions, right? Or other sort of processes where trust plays a fundamental role, such as, I don't know, you want to buy a house, you get the keys when you pay the money, but you're only going to pay the money once you have the key. So it's a classic situation where we have a broker in the middle. While with blockchain, technically, we don't need the broker anymore, right? So I think these application areas are huge. I think over the last couple of years, we've really seen organizations starting to implement it. So if I were to study blockchain, now is a good time to do that, right? Because now we see how that can work. But I think it has huge potential. And I like it in the sense of that it's one of these examples where we can see how we can do other things with BPM other than efficiency and operational excellence and stuff like that, right? So the first thing that drove me away from BPM, where we said, well, we have application areas, we have nothing to give to them. And there's a few other ones. Emerging technologies was another one where we said, like, people want to do things with AI, or earlier with mobile phones and social technologies. But there was nothing in the BPM handbook that told them how to do that. So it's the same with a blockchain, in that it brings to focus this idea of compliance, which is a traditional focus BPM, but it's also an area where proportionally we haven't put the most emphasis on. A lot of the emphasis has been on efficiency gains and so forth. But compliance is a huge driver if you think about it. One of the big waves of BPM was with Sarbanes-Oxley, and some of these acts that stipulated documentation for lots of processes of publicly listed companies. So they had to do BPM, right?
Yeah.
So it was always there, but it was sort of always simmering sort of at low heat there. And I think blockchain brings it to the focus. And then I think that's exciting, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And I guess in talking about other sort of newer ways of process management, process mining obviously is a very popular topic at the moment, and robotic process automation is also another topic at the moment. What sort of trends are you noticing? What do you see coming up in the next 2, 3, 5 years? Where do you think organizations should be investing their time, effort, and energy? And obviously every organization will be at a different process maturity level. So some organizations are already have 200 bots deployed and are already using process mining, and others, have nothing documented at right now. But what are you noticing as we move into the future?
Well, I think that if you think of it as a sort of like a technology hype cycle, I mean, process mining and behind that RPA, I suppose, is sort of they're hitting a plateau where many organizations can start implementing and using and really get something out of it, right? I think you're right. At the moment, there are companies doing this, but if you look at it closely, they're few and far in between. It's not your everyday company. If I go here into the city and ask companies whether they're using process mining, they're not. So some are, and the question is which companies are doing this. So they're sort of technology centric, I suppose, and they'd be large. they'd be having lots of high volume, fairly standardized transactional processes. Yeah, your retailers, your banks, your service organizations, where you have these companies have always been at the forefront of BPM for good reasons, right? And you're sort of small and medium-sized company. No, they sort of, I don't know whether they'll ever get to that, right? You could ask the question, why is that? But we don't have to go there for now. But so I think that's happening, but that'll keep them busy for the next 10 years or so until they really get a lot of the value out of process mining. And there's also still a lot of research that needs to be done in this area, not so much on the technology itself, but sort of on the deployment, on the adoption. What do people get out of it? So in a way, for me, this is similar to what we've been doing 15 years ago around the new process modeling standards. There's always the same questions come up. Should I adopt it? What should I do with this? What are the obstacles? What are the sort of value levers? What are the benefits? When can I get these benefits? How long do I have to wait for my return on investment? So whenever there's a new technology coming up, that's always the same question. RPA is the same thing, a couple of years beyond. Now you ask in the future. I mean, the obvious answer there, the next fringe technology was probably AI. In this sense of AI being what it is now, like a machine learning, supervised, unsupervised learning technologies, where you just deploy that algorithm and let it learn for a while and optimize the process. That can be applied to processes, right? So if you had an analysis process that runs on process mining data and generates new ideas, and if it's a digital process, you could actually implement these ideas and sort of self-optimize after a while. I think that could be the next big thing. It's an algorithm for doing BPM. And that's what the research at the moment is doing, right? So they're looking a lot at AI technologies applied to the different stages of BPM, whether it be modeling, an AI doing the modeling, an AI doing the analysis, or an AI providing the redesign recommendations, right? So I think that's the next big thing. It's sort of, imagine you have a BPM suite and it's run by an AI and it just gives you suggestions all the time. You just can tick it off, and sort of keep an intervention lever for humans there for a while until it just runs by itself. I think that's the next big thing. And then after this, God knows, right?
That's right. I have heard, not many people are talking about it, but but what does the future look like when you do combine artificial intelligence with process mining and robotic process automation? Will we have sort of tools that are, I guess, smart enough that they are continuously improving on the process without sort of any human intervention? Will that sort of lead to potential problems that, unless the computer is told or the bot's told what to look for, could that, will there be negative impacts there? Is that, obviously that's something that would need to be considered and thought through, but what does the future look like? And then through that sort of looking at that same through that same lens is, what does the workforce look like in the future? Will we have large organizations that are predominantly run by bots, or will we have, where does all of these resources, where do they get redeployed to? I think is an interesting question.
I think, when we talk about these sort of automation initiatives and with AI taking over a lot of the jobs, I think we need to realize a few things. So number one, in a lot of service pros, that's already happening. Some of the banks and insurance companies that I, as a client, just work with, like demo providers, I don't get anyone on the phone anymore. It's just all chatbots. So that's already happening, and they are self-optimizing the way that they run these conversations, and they're optimizing these processes of handling my inquiry and whatever else I want to do. So that's already happening. So that's not something too distant in the future. At the same time, I think what that example also shows is there's always going to be a need for augmentation. There's always got to be human and machines working together, right? So we know that. So we know that bots or other types of AI or autonomous tools can do certain things, but they can't do all. And there's certain class of problems that we need human intervention as well. For a couple of reasons, like ethically, for example, fairness. can't be handled by an algorithm. Discrimination can't be handled by an algorithm. We know that by now. So, we know situations that we need to figure out ways of collaborating between man and machine. Now, what does it mean for your call center? It means that, well, maybe you're not handling the next call, but you'll have to be there to step in and overlook, and maybe you need to be making the decisions, or you need to review these decisions, whatever augmentation can mean. But augmentation is, the one thing we do know is that augmentation is needed, right? So that means there's always going to be a place. Of course, the roles will be shifting, but not necessarily to the worse. If you think about what most customer call center processes, inquiries are, they're fairly boring in high volume. So why not, deploy a bot to handle most of them? And most of them, that's just a quicker way of getting your answer. So that's fine. And then there's other situations where we need to figure out what that augmentation, so that man-machine coordination, what that can look like, because that configuration isn't trivial, right? And it could be, depends on the problem, it could depend on the process, could depend on the person or the technology or the context, I don't know. And so we'll have to figure out what that looks like. And I think that'll keep us busy for a while.
Yep. Fantastic. Well, Jan, it's been an absolute privilege sitting down with you today and having this conversation. I've been taking a lot of notes here and gleaning a lot from this conversation. And I know that our audience will have gleaned a lot from this talk as well. It's certainly went on a different tangent and a different angle to a lot of our other conversations. But I think these are very interesting topics to talk about and to discuss, and to understand that, if you're an organization, you need to be aware of what is coming in the future, what technology can we use to support our journey, how can we, if we're not in that sort of top tier or top echelon in the marketplace, what sort of tools can we use to our advantage to take us to that next level. So I just want to thank you for sitting down and having this conversation with me today.
Thank you, Daniel, for having me. I've been a fan of the podcast series, and obviously of all the other people that I want to give a shout out to, lots of old friends and colleagues and inspirational role models there. So maybe some of them are listening, and if not, your audience surely appreciates what you're doing here. So thank you so much.